Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I am your host, Jon Macri, fantasy analyst here at PFF. And I'm going solo today because for the first time on this show, we're bringing you some IDP content. Before you turn it off, because if you think drafting individual defensive players is a bridge too far, just hear me out, because this episode is going to kind of serve as a bit of an intro for IDP while also diving into the overall draft strategy for fantasy leagues that include IDPs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over my personal favorite settings and scoring for IDP leagues to try and balance the positions as best as possible. And if you're watching on the YouTubes, I'll share some images of what that looks like as well. You'll also get an idea of my IDP rankings and thought process behind why certain players and positions are ranked the way they are. And I promise you, by the end of this episode, you will be ready for your IDP fantasy drafts and ready to dominate the 2023 season. I'm excited to get into it. But before we get into all that, I do want to mention that this episode is sponsored by the good people over at Fabric by Gerber Life. Fall is all about the back to school and back to routine checklist. And the most important task on that list should be securing your family's financial future, starting with life insurance. Fabric by Gerber Life makes it quick, easy, and affordable to protect your family so you can get back to enjoying life. Fabric was designed by parents for parents to help you get a high-quality, surprisingly affordable term life insurance policy in less than 10 minutes. Fabric has flexible policies that fit your family and your budget, with quality policies like $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day. Get your personalized quote in just minutes and then apply when it's convenient for you. It's all online and on your schedule. You can go from start to covered in less than 10 minutes with no health exam required. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy. meetfabric.com/fantasy. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company. Not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. All right, let's start this off with a quick rundown of the basics before we get into the draft strategy. There are plenty of different ways to run your IDP league, and none of them are wrong. If you want to just start with choosing like one single IDP for your lineup requirements, that's perfectly fine. If you want to dive in head first with 53-man rosters and 32-team leagues with 11 starting IDPs or more, all the power to you. Score them however you like. Either way, the main thing is having fun with it. We all love football and fantasy football, so we're all looking to do, all we're looking to do here is add to that with a bigger pool of NFL players to choose from and add to the weekly excitement. So starting with the basics here, when it comes to maybe like my preferred settings or lineup requirements specifically, and again, set the league up however you like and your league and however your league mates are comfortable with, just to kind of get a feel for the format if you want. But what I would typically want is for the offensive and defensive players to have the same amount of starters. So in this case, I'll be looking at 10 offensive players, 10 defensive players, perfectly balanced, as all things should be. This will it'll work out to be about a 30-round draft, so longer obviously than typical drafts, but hey, drafting is the most fun part of the offseason, so really we're just extending the fun here if we're being honest. For the sake of the breakdown of what those 10 offense and 10 IDPs look like, and we put that much because otherwise this whole exercise is kind of pointless. We won't really need a strategy otherwise. So we'll use 10 starters for each, for both sides of the ball, which on offense means 1 quarterback, a minimum of 2 running backs, minimum of 3 wide receivers, minimum of 1 starting tight end as well, and then 3 flex spots. On the IDP side, we want 2 edge or defensive ends, a minimum of 1 defensive tackle, a minimum of 3 linebackers, and at least 1 cornerback and 1 safety, with 2 IDP flex options, which can either be an additional DT, linebacker, cornerback, or safety. For that flex spot, typically you'll want to You want that to be the linebacker since that's the position that generates the most tackles, and tackles create the large majority of IDP production no matter the scoring. But obviously, depending on your options, you can still pivot to another position if needed. Speaking of scoring, this is what we'll be looking to kind of create the most balanced scoring across all IDP positions. So most of the box score stats outside of tackles are going to be scored similarly across each position. But to get that balanced IDP scoring, we'll need to be able to adjust the tackle scoring by position, which is why MFL, my fantasy league, is a great platform to do just that. So if we look at tackles for defensive linemen, we'll need those to be the highest of the positions if we can do that, since they typically generate the fewest amount of tackles. So putting them at 2.5 for solos, 1.25 for assists, I find helps their value become more balanced. We know linebackers generate the most tackles, so they'll have the lowest scoring output for tackles, which is still going to create high fantasy production. It's not going to nerf them completely. So 1.5 for solos, 0.75 for assists. And then the defensive backs, so corners and safeties, we'll put those guys at 2 points for a solo and 1 point for an assist. Other than that, it's 4 points for a sack, 1 additional point for a TFL, 2 points for a PBU, and 2 points for a quarterback hit for those defensive linemen, and 1 for all the other positions, so that we can give those high-end pass rushers the credit they deserve and help them boost the sacks to balance scoring as well. So if the scoring is done correctly, just looking at last year's totals inside the top 20 IDPs, for example, we'll see a nice even breakdown amongst the top defensive scorers. And I have that up on the screen here for the YouTube crowd to show exactly what that looks like. And you can see that we have 8 edge defenders, 7 linebackers, 3 defensive backs, and 2 defensive tackles. A very nice balance within that top 20, and that continues outside of this range as well. Sometimes you see leagues where it's like 18 linebackers in the top 20, and that's just not nearly as fun because the best players on the field, the Nick Bosas, the Myles Garretts, the Micah Parsons of the world, aren't properly accounted for, so they become devalued, which isn't really what we want for balanced scoring, since we want to properly value the best defensive players in the league as well. All right, with all that out of the way, we can kind of get into the rankings and kind of where to actually take these IDPs as we figure out how to value them among the offensive players of the league. And for anyone that's listening that wants a write-up of this, I have my updated Offense+ IDP Draft Strategy article for the website that should be out on Friday morning on PFF.com, and that'll have the full scoring and lineup requirements, all the updated rankings, all included in there as well. So definitely check that out as well as a good reference point, because I know it can be hard to kind of keep track of all these numbers that I'm saying for scoring and stuff like that, just through audio. So we'll have that up on PFF.com as well. All right, quickly, let's take one last ad break before we get into this. And this is from our friends at DraftKings. College football fans, are you ready for week 1? DraftKings Sportsbook is hooking you up with a can't-miss offer to start the season strong. This week, new customers can bet just $5 on college football and score $200 in bonus bets instantly. Anything can happen in college football. Your team could go from unranked to dynasty mode in just a couple of years. Changes come fast. The only thing that's a lock is the great offers from DraftKings Sportsbook. Life's more fun when you're in on the action. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code PFF. New customers can score $200 in bonus bets instantly, and they bet just $5 on college football. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook with code PFF. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly on behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort. 21 plus, age varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. See dkng.co/football for eligibility terms and responsible gaming resources. Bonus bets expire 7 days after issuance. Eligibility and deposit restrictions apply. All right, let's start our draft strategy now. And the main thing to keep in mind here is that in an offense plus IDP draft, it's going to start out almost exactly like any other draft you're doing, as we want to attack the best players on offense first and build our team around those stars. So even though we have defensive players included now, we don't need to be taking these guys in the first 3 rounds of drafts, even though you may see some of your league mates do so. The important thing to remember is that defensive production can be much less stable year to year than offense. So we're really focusing on kind of the surefire offensive production early before it dries up, because it will dry up quickly. Whereas IDP is very deep. And I can promise you, if you follow my rankings, you'll find plenty of value late in drafts. So do not panic if you see defensive players coming off the board earlier than expected. There will be lots of opportunities to address these positions, these IDP positions, once we get most of our offense figured out. So if you do want to go after IDPs early, I'd say the absolute earliest I would suggest is near the end of the 4th round, after you have at least 3 offensive starters locked in. And the only IDP position I'd addressed early is the edge position, and only going after the top tier edge rushers first and foremost, especially in this balanced format. So my top 5 edge defenders are Micah Parsons, Max Crosby, Nick Bosa, Myles Garrett, and TJ Watt. So the argument for edge first here is that you want stability and reliability at the position. And it's a position that relies heavily on sacks, right? So sacks unfortunately happen to be one of the most unstable stats to predict. So we're really betting on talent here and the stable metrics that actually lead to sacks. So things like PFF pass rush grade, pressure rate, win rate, playing time, of course, and those kind of give us the best starting point for a clear advantage at the position. So the other reason you want to go defensive line first here is because it's also the most difficult to replace in season. If you lose one of those starters early on, and I'll highlight this a little bit more just a bit, but they're a lot harder to find on the waiver wire to replace them if something were to happen to your starters. So it's a position that isn't just relying on overall opportunity for fantasy production, like a linebacker and safety position, for example. The defensive line guys, we need talent as well, as these guys are going head to head with offensive linemen on every snap. So they need to be able to win those reps more often than not in order to score points. Where linebacker and defensive back, a lot of the time, tackles often just kind of happen to those positions as a result of being on the field. And we don't necessarily need the best players at those positions. We just need them to get the playing time, right? So we don't need to target the name value of linebacker or defensive back, for example. Playing time is going to be the main thing that we're looking for at those positions. So if you're going to go after IDPs in the first 6 or 7 rounds, definitely make it defensive linemen, because we will be able to find plenty of linebackers later on, and on the waiver wire every single week for similar production. Don't feel like you need to go after a Roquan Smith, Foye Oluokun, Nick Bolton early, especially with some strong offensive players still on the board when those guys likely start getting drafted. And especially if we can target some high-end defensive linemen still to make sure that position is airtight before moving on to some of the other IDP positions. So by the time we've reached the end of the 8th round, you'll likely want to have at least one starting quarterback, anywhere from 1 to 4 running backs, or 2 to 4 wide receivers. You could have one tight end, and depending on how hard you went after offense or not, we want to have at least one starting edge. Can be as many as 2 within these first 8 rounds. Some people will have addressed linebacker right now or by now, but I wouldn't recommend it, since, trust me, there will be a ton of starting linebacker options available still that can put up strong tackle production. And that's all we're really looking for at the linebacker position. Anything on top of that is bonus. So as we head into these next few rounds after those first 8 that we just talked about, So let's say round 9 to 12 here. From the IDP side of things, especially in this preferred balanced format, and lineup requirements that we talked about earlier, we want to try to grab a starting defensive tackle somewhere in this range, whether you're looking for Aaron Donald, Quinnen Williams, Javon Hargrave, any of those top options. I know it's not the sexiest position to draft, but I promise you will have you'll save yourself a ton of headache basically in season to have a quality stable starter there at what is typically a more volatile position where production is harder to come by. So there's some very good defensive tackle options this year, but they dry up pretty fast. So be sure to lock them up even before you go after your linebackers, would be my main suggestion here. People will talk about like anchor linebackers, like trying to get one of the top guys and then filling it out rest with other guys off the waiver wire or whatever. You don't even need to do that. You just need to find the guys that are going to have guaranteed playing time, and we'll find that in spades as we get later in the draft. So go after the defensive tackle, mixed in with maybe filling out your offensive lineup, potentially another starting edge in these 4 rounds of round 9 to 12 or so. And then we can worry about linebacker very soon. Again, main thing, do not panic if linebackers are coming off the board quicker than you think. It just means you'll be able to load up on more valuable positions on offense and on the defensive line. If you're seeing more offensive value fall, don't hesitate to attack it. I promise. Again, follow my IDP rankings and tiers, which I'll have the updated versions of up on the website Thursday morning, and you'll still find some excellent value among IDPs later on to make up for that. So basically, continue to add talent and depth on the defensive line. That's going to be one of the most important things you can do in a balanced IDP draft, because if one of these guys goes down for any period of time, finding a truly like worthy replacement off the waiver wire or deeper into your bench is much more difficult. So I did actually put together a visual of this. You could find it in the article that's coming out Friday morning, or you could look at it right here on the YouTube as well, which looks at kind of what happened when the top IDPs at each position missed time last season and what their immediate replacements were able to provide when they filled in. Because a lot of the time, if we lose a starter, we're looking for the next man up on the team, on the waiver wire, especially at linebacker and safety, but it happens along the defensive line as well. So in 2022, when a top scoring edge went down, so this is any combination of some of the top scorers who averaged maybe nearly 14 fantasy points per game, their immediate replacements that filled in for them combined for an average of just 6.8 fantasy points per game. So we're taking a massive hit there in weekly production, going from 14 to 6.8. Defensive tackle was very similar. In the top scoring starters were averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game, but when they missed time, their backups only averaged 7 points per game. And in neither case, edge or defensive tackle, did any of the backups actually outperform the starters that they replaced. So something to keep in mind there. Again, mentioning how difficult it can be to find replacements off the waiver wire, and why we want to maybe attack some of the better options early on in IDP drafts. When you compare that to linebacker, where, for example, you're only losing actually about 3 points per game on average from that position, but there's also more cases of the backups at the next man up that we pick up off the waiver wire actually having better games than the starters on occasion, because again, opportunity is the biggest thing, and a lot of the time that production will happen to them rather than them earning it. So again, just making a much easier case to replace in season. Same thing at safety, where we're only losing about 2.5 points per game, with replacements outperforming starters on a number of occasions there as well. So much easier to replace linebacker and defensive back on the waiver wire than it is defensive line, is the kind of lesson there basically. So again, extremely important to kind of keep this in mind when drafting, and it's a big reason to not panic and draft linebacker or safety early, because as long as you remain active on the waiver wire in season, you'll be able to fill those positions with capable options, no problem. Once we kind of get into rounds 13 to 18 here is where I'd say we can maybe now start attacking the linebacker position a bit more heavily. even add a backup quarterback in there somewhere, other depth on offense. But this is really like the linebacker sweet spot for me, because at this point, we should have at least one quarterback, anywhere between 2 to 5 running backs, or 3 to 6 wide receivers, however we preferred our offense build. But also, we'd have at least a starting tight end, 2 quality edge options, and a potential for our DT1 in there as well. So with those positions loaded up, we can kind of turn our attention to linebacker and scoop up the remaining value to give us the necessary weekly fantasy production that we need for starting linebackers. And a lot of the time, we'll see IDP managers draft based on name value or previous year's production at the linebacker position, which, by the way, it is the wrong way to do it. Okay. So follow my ranks, and there should still be plenty of like my tier 2 and tier 3 linebackers available in these rounds 13 to 18. You can check out pff.com for the full list. But essentially, what we're looking for when ranking linebackers year to year or week to week is first and foremost opportunity. Are they going to be every down linebackers? And there are still plenty in the NFL who are, usually at least one per team, still a number of teams that deploy 2 full-time guys. So identify them first. And then, because like I've mentioned multiple times already, production is more a product of the defense itself than the player. We want to target those zone-heavy defenses that yield higher production for the position, and avoid guys in maybe more man-heavy schemes like a Detroit or a Minnesota, for example, but also the guys who have historically been inefficient tacklers, regardless of defensive scheme and playing time, because that inefficiency has shown to be much more sticky than those who are overly efficient, basically. So average tackle efficiency for linebackers is about 13%. So if we're seeing our linebackers dip lower than that consistently, then we can move on to potentially another option for our starting lineup. But my tier 2 and 3 linebackers consist of like 29 players. Almost all of them are expected to play every down roles or very close to it. So they aren't always the household names that we all know, but that's not what we're looking for here. We just want opportunity, because that's king when it comes to tackle production. So through the first 18 rounds or so, all of our offensive starting positions should be filled out, as well as some of the backups. And for IDPs, we'll want 2, maybe even 3 edge defenders, which sets us up nicely for the year, as these are all likely to be very good players. If you're following along my rankings, 1 to 2 defensive tackles, depending on league requirements. If it's DT required, like we're talking about for this, then you'll want one of those clear starters by now, whether it's Aaron Donald, Javon Hargrave, Quinnen Williams, Jeffrey Simmons, Christian Wilk, whoever. I have 12 of them in my top 2 tiers. So pick your favorite, lock them in every week. You will be good to go there. At linebacker, depending on what you did for depth on offense. And again, if you're seeing value fall on offense, scoop that up first, but you can have anywhere between 1 to 3 linebackers by this point. Now, this next 5 rounds or so, really the large majority of these final rounds will spend on filling out the linebacker position with the best options available, adding a few more depth pieces along the defensive line, and then finally moving on to safety and corner, because I beg of you, whatever you do, don't fall into the trap of drafting DB early. That is by far the deepest position in IDP and all of fantasy, really, because each NFL team is essentially starting at least 2 every down corners every week, almost 3 for most of them. And every team deploys 2 every down safeties. So there are a ton of these guys to target. Even though Jalen Petrie had nearly 150 tackles last season, and L'Jarius Sneed was far and away the best corner, DB production is incredibly unstable year to year. So do not chase last year's production at the position. Just wait until these final rounds. Follow my rankings. You'll find guys to target as the best players available. So a lot of the time for safety and corner production, they can spike due to big plays like interceptions, but those are also incredibly unstable to rely on and can't be accurately predicted consistently. So we want to focus on tackles and tackle opportunities, which means the first thing we want to look at is, after obviously the starting job, is safeties who line up closer to the line of scrimmage and in the box, which yields a better tackle efficiency for the position. So even well over the average tackle efficiency for the position, which hovers around 9%. Those box snaps yields closer to 11%, which over a full season makes a massive difference. That's how my ranks are sorted, by overall opportunity and box opportunity first and foremost. But again, you don't have to go out and target Derwin James, as much as I love him, or Jalen Petrie. Their cost in drafts is way too high for a volatile position where there is a ton of turnover at the top of the fantasy point leaderboards each season there. So punting the safety and cornerback position until the very end is your best path to success in IDP drafts. So that's kind of the gist of it. Just a very quick kind of overview and strategy talk for IDP leagues. I know a lot of people are drafting right now and don't necessarily always know when or where to value IDPs in offensive leagues. So I hope you all find this helpful, getting some more insight into kind of how I approach every single IDP draft that I'm in, which has led to a lot of championships and success in many, many leagues. So I hope it does the same for you. For anyone that wants the article version of this, you'll be able to find it on PFF.com by the end of this week. It'll be up there Friday morning. If you have any questions about IDP or something I've talked about today or didn't talk about today, or just want to talk IDP in general, shoot me a message on the Twitter at PFF_Macri. I'm always happy to help however I can. Once the season starts, I'll also have the weekly IDP fantasy report, which will include waiver wire targets, as well as snap breakdown and usage and notes on every single IDP for every single team, giving you everything you need with a focus on a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. So in my opinion, I might be slightly biased. It is the be all and end all of IDP fantasy tools. So if you spend money on any IDP tool, make it this. I promise you will get everything you possibly need from it and more. You won't be disappointed. So be on the lookout for that on PFF.com every single week once the regular season kicks off. For anyone that enjoyed this episode and enjoys IDP and wants more of this content in the podcast feed, then you're in luck, because also in season, we'll have a weekly IDP preview episode dropping on Thursday mornings to get you ready for the week ahead. And I'll be joined by some of my favorite people in the IDP industry to help me break it all down every week. So very much looking forward to that, and very much looking forward to having somebody else to talk to. So you don't have to just listen to me this entire time, because I could feel my throat drying out as I go over all of this stuff. So I appreciate everybody listening. I hope you all enjoyed this. All my IDP rankings and tiers, as well as a ton of IDP specific articles that I've written this offseason covering breakouts, bounce backs, values, all that stuff can be found on PFF.com. So please check that out as well. Be sure to like and subscribe to the PFF Fantasy YouTube channel. I'd greatly appreciate that. And until next time, IDP's out.